Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in bodywork, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified Rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
It was such a pleasure to be in conversation today with Caryn McHose. Caryn has taught perceptual approaches to movement education for over 50 years. She's a movement artist, a certified advanced Rolfer and Rolf movement practitioner, as well as a somatic experiencing practitioner and certified biodynamic cranial practitioner. She's a collaborator for Body Stories, A Guide to Experiential Anatomy in the Place of Dance by Andrea Olson, and is the co-author with Kevin Frank of How Life Moves, Explorations in Meaning and Body Awareness, of which we post a link to on this page. In today's conversation, we spoke about Caryn's origins into the world of dance, movement, somatics, and eventually structural integration. We hear her views on perceptual awareness, different ways and styles of learning, evolutionary movements, meeting people where we perceive them to be, a lived experience somatically, being in safe and supported experiences which nourish our nervous systems, and more. It was a really exciting talk for all three of us, and we hope you enjoy it. So with that, let's begin our talk.
Hi, Nikki. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Caryn.
Nice to see you again. Good.
Nice to see you too. I'll say that I'm really excited to be in talks with you, Caryn, because I've had the fortune of studying underneath you, and it was one of the probably most helpful things I've done in my bodywork practice, but also I think in my personal life. Is sort of there was just so much I got out of it, which I wouldn't even begin to be able to describe because the words would not even do justice. But that being said, I'm really excited to have you on and to share you and your wealth of knowledge with others. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'm delighted to have the adventure of seeing what happens in the flow of this conversation.
Yeah, same. And I'm noticing in myself that like a lot of excitement and also like, oh, which way are we going to go? And having to just keep stepping it back, calming down and saying, well, wherever it's going to flow is where it's going to flow. So let's get out of my little monkey mind into the floor and let's talk. So there's a lot that we can talk about. We had some pre-ideas, one sort of would be sort of what brought you to this place. But what I'm sort of curious is there anything in particular that you're called to talk about, to start with, to grow from, or anything like that?
I think from what I'm drawn to, because it's what I'm drawn to in my life now, is to trust that something will emerge from not my trying to jockey with all the excitement and the wondering how it's going to go and all of those moments that as I was taking a little walk, that it always feels like a blessing when what arises from the meeting and connecting to people, and that I don't have to know. and that the emergent form will come through our collaborative inquiry and sharing. And then I feel that it's coming from this pretty vast world, inner world and outer world, but then from the particularity of my journey through it and how I've made relationship to living and to this work and to movement. And at this point, I really want to trust all those biological years I've been here to assemble themselves in some way that is appropriate for this moment of meeting.
Well, I'll gladly poke at the emergent. You and I, this is the first time we've met virtually, but I've heard of you, I've known of you for quite some time. I've been certified for almost 20 years, and I was fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of the dual certification that was offered in Brazil.
Aha.
So your name has always come up in the movement education, and I just actually did a deep dive with Rebecca and Eileen with studying tonic function and G prime and their influence with Hubert. And I'm just because you've always, like, I feel like your knowledge is constantly being dropped in all the little places I've been in my Rolf movement journey. Mm-hmm. I'm really curious of what was your first, like, aha or inspiration to start diving into, maybe it wasn't Rolf movement, for some kind of somatic inquiry. Like, where did this bud start for you and how is it blossoming?
Yeah, I know those moments very well. I was a dancer, and I started movement education, you could say, or studying modern dance, creative dance, when I was 5. And I was taken to the class because I was very withdrawn in terms of, and my mother said that I seemed kind of clumsy to her. And so she thought dance would help. And I had the good fortune, I was living in Pennsylvania in State College, and there was an amazing dance teacher there who I remember the moment the doors opened to the studio as a 5-year-old. And I just opened into this space of freedom and joy and permission to express myself without words. And that was miraculous because words were hard for me. I was more kind of autistic, if you want to go that direction. I think I was so full of nature, my nature and the nature that I was immersed in the farmlands of Pennsylvania. And the magic, or it seemed to me then, the magic of observing crawdads in the creek, butterflies, waving wheat fields. So I studied with this person and, till I basically was teaching for her, went up through her school, and she had this amazing arts camp in which she would use art styles to teach us composition. But the manner, she wasn't teaching us steps, even though we had our technique and so on and so forth. But she had us improvise from different topics. And so I spent a lot of time improvising and choreographing on a mountainside with rocks, with cow pies, with grasses, with the cows mooing in the distance, with trees, climbing trees. So I moved in nature very, very early, and it seemed second nature to me. Anyway, that fortune of not only studying, back then they had things like recordings from all over the world of archaic or different cultures. And we used to read about the cultures and discuss them, and then we would start improvising or choreographing from that perspective. But it was always self-referential, that she had us learn form, but be informed by how we were responding to it, and then assembling that into a piece or an improvisational thing. So that's always been there. And when I was 16, she told me, you have to go, because we had moved to Connecticut. She said, you have to start teaching now. And that was a terror for me, because that meant I would have to stand up in front of people. So the thing that I learned there is, in going through that gateway for me, is after drawing thousands of classes and so on and so forth, that once I started moving, the words came. So flow happened to me from dynamic movement and my capacity to feel the joy of that movement, or sharing with people how movement, for me, can allow you to feel more easy in your body, if I put it simply back then. So that's when I started teaching. And then in my 20s.
Can you, maybe you're just getting there. So from 5, you studied intensely with this particular teacher who sounds like was a great inspiration, encouraged you to start teaching. At what age was that?
16. I said, when I was 16, and I had moved away from Pennsylvania, and I lived in Connecticut, and I started to teach at community centers and rec departments. And so anyway, I started on the teaching journey, and then ended up with an injury. I ended up teaching at Middlebury College and had an injury, and they said it was chondromalacia, that I'd have to have a surgery. And I said, Anyway, I'd written to my dance teacher, and she told me about this book, The Thinking Body. And I devoured that for 5 years. I got anatomy books, and I started to read all the books until I remapped my entire skeletal system and muscular system, and kind of learned about, what's under the skin too. And because that had idiokinesis in it, I started to slow down my teaching and work with perception and movement. And that took me on a whole nother direction of actually changing my coordination in my knee joint and my leg and my whole body to create more space where I had a pattern going that wasn't useful. And at that time, I found the integration of the structure, because in those days, in the late 70s and 80s, there were, just a handful of books about body work on the bookstore shelves. So there was Feldenkrais and Ida Rolf and Alexander. And I loved Ida Rolf's book, The Integration of the Structure. So I used that book to teach myself a way to organize perception and movement and learning about the inner map of the skeletal system and working with pre-movement, although I didn't have the word for that, but it was with the perception of that. So, yeah.
So, could we back up a little bit? I would love for our audience and also for my education to hear from you let's dive in a little bit of perception and movement, and what does that really mean, and how does that evoke intrinsic movement, pre-movement? Can we dive into that a little bit?
Yes. No, I'm just going there in my body to answer the question. How does that?
And why I'm asking this too is I feel like interoception and things like that are starting. I know that's stuff that we've kind of talked about in the structural integration world and the mind-body world, but I'm starting to see and hear more of this in podcasts and other movements. So I think it's like catching on. It's like the buzzword, like how psoas was a super popular anatomy at one point.
Right.
Right. Perception, interoception. Yeah.
Well, that's what happened to me, was like all of a sudden when Todd was talking about idiokinesis and imagined idea of motion, an idea in motion, that's a perception that I could imagine first. And lo and behold, if I was present in the sensations of my body, I would notice coordination would change with some of these perceptions that were offered by her. Some of them were, as Hubert called them, but back then she just had arrows, directions, a vector drawn, a line with an arrow going. So there were spatial directions of out, and there were spatial directions of down. And there was talk about mass. And then from Ida Rolf's, from the integration of the structure, there was the whole talking of gravity. And that made sense to me in terms of motion, of feeling in dancing, weight and space and swing. And so I started to slow down the technique I'd been teaching, formal dance technique, along with improvisation, to work on some of the forms, pliés and releves, and work with the leg that you learn in formal dance training, and start to use and draw in and embody in my imagination what happened if I actually felt the perception of a vector or a sense of space before I did the motion. And so, it was being in touch with everything under the skin, the blood side of the skin, while I was actually an action would happen in space. And things really changed, but I had to slow way, way down. Is that something that feels understandable to you, Nikki?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Caryn, I want to add on, one of my experiences in a similar regard is just now when you were waiting to answer and you were sort of feeling it. I remember, and I've talked about this with you before and with others, being in class with you, not cognitively understanding something, coming up to you saying, Caryn, blah, blah, blah. And before you would respond with words, I would sometimes be like, oh, I got it. That there was something perceptual, felt other that, and my the way that I understand it maybe is that you were feeling it in your body, whatever I'm asking.
Yes.
And then whatever resonance of that I somehow would pick up and would be like, oh yeah, I got it. Thank you. And it was a very life-changing, might be a bit over dramatic, but it did definitely change how I perceive, how I understand. It changed entirely how I work with people.
Thank you, Andrew, because I think in what I've spoken so far, I have learning differences. And so speaking and school were very difficult for me. And so having a way to slow down enough to acknowledge what's under the skin and having the time to actually feel motion and to feel the ease that would come, and then the representation of my experience in words was not so much of a problem. It made sense for me. And so it's like that moment that I had to cross when I realized, oh, if I start to move, I can communicate to people, but I have to feel my here. Where am I in space? And I have to feel my volume, and I have to hear what my body's saying to then find the words to speak from there, along with the representational words that name things and string words together. Mm-hmm. And that's...
And for me...
Yeah, go ahead.
For me to add on to that, because I'm very similar, and I got labeled with different learning disabilities for communication. Ironic that I have a podcast, and that there was the way how I just heard what you said is very similar. That all of a sudden I found I have these ways of not being able to communicate as a quote unquote normal person, yet these other ways of existing with the world. And there was almost a sort of, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just a little different, and that's okay. Which was, it might sound very obvious, but yet whatever my inability to communicate as a, again, quote unquote, normal person had its own internal conflicts. And this way of being really like freed up a lot of that stuff, that guilt or whatever was there. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's taken me all the way to 70 to be more and more okay that this is how I am. And also just let loose in the connection to people through body talk, through body stories, through actually listening to people that way, and feeling that type of communication in myself.
Well, I think just this little nugget of us acknowledging, also me too, was acknowledged as a different learner. And this is really relevant in my life right now. I have 2 young kids, an 8 and a 5-year-old. And it is, especially with my 8-year-old, and especially coming out of a pandemic, a year of isolation. Wow. I homeschooled with virtual learning. And it is showing up even with my son, his friends, like and it's great because, and I feel very privileged in the fact that this is even being acknowledged in a public school, that really respecting how different kids are learning differently and taking a moment. And I think the weird mixed blessing in the pandemic, it has, in some ways, we're like, all right, we got to slow down. We got to take a step back. We need to do a little catch up for whatever things that were missed in that odd time of learning for kids. And just really appreciating, like it's interesting. My kid has some kind of dyslexia. It's not like this classic stamp of like, we're going to, for sure you have it, but they're like, he has a unique way of learning. Mm-hmm. And we're doing tutoring this summer, and it's fun to kind of see and witness how he learns. And the tutor is really cool because there's like tapping, they use little blocks to build words. It's this whole different way. Wow. And she's telling me like, oh, this is how to review. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I might need to be tutored how to do, because it's almost amazing. How did I learn how to read? But I think I learned just from memorization. It never was an embodied experience. And my son's, his progression with reading is like so much because it's a body experience, not just going through flashcards and memorizing that there's a rhythm and there's a pattern to be recognized in the way our language is built. And so I think for any parents or any adults that are listening to this, just kind of recognizing that we all learn in a different way, and it's not a matter of a right or wrong. It's probably just take an appreciation of and embodying the experience. So there's an opportunity to learn it in a way that is authentic, authentic to our own learning styles.
I'm so happy to hear that, Nikki, because that's my dream for everyone, that the different styles of learning can be appreciated, which is actually, I think, is the different styles of being alive. And it's about that connecting to the differentiation and yet communication, whatever it is, the stuff that flows between, and the delight of being able to understand through different sensory channels that are embodied in this bag of skin we have. And it just makes me happy to hear that. I did not have that. And so, but I had dance, and I had this teacher that just, opened the door of her studio, and I learned a lot, and then how to communicate the joy of movement.
Which I think is now what we're talking about, like our early childhoods and how we learned and the importance of embodiment. But then I think, and as you're saying this, and it kind of comes and goes in this fascination with the job that I have, and especially with working with movement and getting people off the table.
Yes.
And, I work with some kids, but most of my population clientele is of adults. And it is so much is coming back to taking time, feeling, and it's subtle, but it's like when they're getting off the table and finding their feet on the floor and be like, okay, before you just spring up, what does your feet feel like to the carpet? What does the carpet feel like underneath? What can you connect into the earth? Like making it very big and broad. And just those little moments of, they take like, I don't know, a couple minutes at max of taking time to explore your surrounding before getting up and feeling into the structural changes that happen with, me working on tissue. And it's always fun, and it feels complex especially with all the amount of education and studying and learning and all this. And then when getting off the table and the clients are like, oh, wow, I feel like how I felt when I was a kid. And it's like coming back to this primitive movement. It's like, oh my gosh, it really is so simple if we just get out of our way and allow ourselves to feel.
It's so simply, beautifully stated by you, Nikki, that I'd say that what kind of the miracle of what happened to me when I was introduced to not only being, free to move in space and in the studio, but when I started to read the pioneers and understand that they were considering, how we move and how do we care for people so they can move more freely in their body and be easier in their body. And that it is so simple because it's so holistic to include yourself in the proposition of how I'm communicating to someone and what my touch is saying to someone and what my movements are saying to someone, that it's those sensory channels that can be open to being in the present moment, and how that just switching that changes coordination and amplifies the kind of creaturehood we have to feel the world and to express, the express what's next. And the slowing down, because that's the journey that I think when I started to meet structural integrators, because back then it was in my 20s, late 20s, I heard about Rolfing, but all I heard was, holy smokes, I changed a lot or it hurt a lot, but then, I couldn't integrate it, that it was going to hurt. But I just loved what Ida Rolf wrote about. And so in the teaching of dance classes or the movement classes, I was not afraid to, even though some of the movement people would get impatient because I had to slow them down so much to receive impression, to actually slow down, to perceive a differentiated segment in their body, to open the different channels and to wait for the non-doing of the coordination from the movement brain emerge. And that's the biggest story that unfolds, I think, in being a structural integrator is, and to do the Rolf movement or movement work with people in perception, is that such a vast, big territory that feels so simple. I should be doing more. But there's nothing to do. It's allow people to perceive more, to feel more, and to feel this response of their body coming home to inherent ease and starting to confront some of the patterns of rushing or overcoupled or, repetitive things that need some time to be looked at from a whole different fix-it model to a model of being with perception.
Caryn,
yeah,
I love, and I use it a lot, either with my clients or just internal, the 4 words I learned from you of pause in your pause.
Yes, exactly. Until a client walks out and they always say, well, what can I do? I'd say the first homework assignment I give them is pause in the pause, that the hands and feet and the rami, if they're sitting or wherever they are, is how many times can they interrupt their, quote, normal flow in a conversation, in the middle of a Zoom meeting, in the middle of a whatever, and pause in the pause. And there was a period of time when I have a piece that I call table manners, and the table manners of how you can do it at any table, where you just put your hands on the table, and your manners are that you're feeling the person across from you through the surface of the table, and you're feeling the ground through your feet until that conversation is felt, and to feel the kind of stabilizing that happens in the two directions. You know, if your tail is feeling space and a weight orientation, and if your head is belonging to the sky, how pausing in the quadruped, if you will, or the sitting quadruped pause are supporting that surface, and you get to dial back on the overreaching or the overdoing. And the work there is about learning to non-do as you receive the support from the ground and the table by pausing in your pause.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to do something I almost never do in the podcast, which is bring us back on track a little bit. I'm the one who's usually like, let's go way off to left field. But let's go back a bit to Caryn and sort of this unfolding of your story of what has sort of brought you
Yes.
here, if we can.
Yeah. How did I get connected to structural integrators is I left my situation at Middlebury College because I was pregnant and, had a baby, was going to have a baby, and I had that baby. And I moved to Maine, and during that time, a colleague of mine, Andrea Olson, wrote a book called The Thinking Body that was based on the course that I developed at Middlebury College, Experiential Anatomy for Theater and Athletic Performance. So I got to have semester after semester of these wonderful students to try out how to work with perception and movement and work with their posture, or their what I'd call their orientation now. So anyway, I had a client. What I didn't say is, because of all the teaching I was doing, all of a sudden I'd slowed down so much that I realized, I'd start doing things in class for people, and then I realized I can't do this. So I had a body work practice. I didn't even know what that was, but I met with people to help them slow down the pausing in their pause and working with perception and movement. And that's how all of a sudden I was seeing people individually. I had no degrees. I was not a massage therapist. I was a movement teacher who then was doing tiny movement sessions or movement explorations, and they were learning experiential anatomy, but individually. Anyway, I was in Maine, and the book had been published, and I had a client who said to Tom Myers, did you know that Caryn McHose lives near? And so Tom called me up, and that's kind of the first Rolfer that I met. And he invited me to do some teaching with him and Jim Oshman and Dean Juhan. And all of a sudden, I was hanging out with a whole lot of Rolfers, and that was new. So, I knew nothing about structural integration other than what I'd read and what I'd been practicing through movement, doing movement education with people. And anyway, that just, changed my life. And so all of a sudden I was teaching a lot of movement to Rolfers or to structural integrators. And that's how I met my partner, Kevin Frank. And he seemed to be as interested in various questions about movement as much as I was, because he had been studying with Hubert Godard. And he said to me, I haven't had movement instruction like, it sounds like you're working with perception like Hubert does, and I see people changing and you're not touching. And that made him curious. How were people changing their motor patterns, their coordination, the sense of how they were oriented? And I didn't have those kind of languages back then, but that's how we started to collaborate. And then, I finally met Hubert and started to study with him as much as I could. And then I decided to join the club. I think I was in my 60s, something like that. But I think I graduated from let me think about this. Yeah, because the opportunity came to me. Kevin and I had a studio, and the Rolf Institute was experimenting with doing an off-site training. So Duffy was living in Vermont, and that's how I had a kind of dual between Duffy, and Kevin was doing the movement stuff. So I got to have this wonderful training in my own studio. And
I remember when that little satellite training happened.
Yeah. So that's how I, finally joined the club. But I'd been joined a long time ago, just kept for I guess several decades in terms of taking classes with Hubert and then teaching with Kevin as we started to join our different perspectives, me with the evolutionary movement stuff, because I found a playful way, and that seemed to go with the experiential anatomy of using some of the architectural forms that have been on Earth in describing a way to differentiate the axis from the girdles, differentiate the gut tube and the organ system, and in different ways of approaching with the pause to create the stability to have more flow, to see the tonic functioning in the gravity response. So I was passionate about that.
Caryn, when I hear like some of those words, like especially evolutionary, the movements, my first thought is, or my first impulse is to think of continuum, which I know you're influenced by continuum, or maybe not influenced, but connected through continuum. Is that where for you, is that where the evolutionary stuff came in, or is that later?
No,
how
the evolutionary came in because when I was at Middlebury, my dear friend and colleague Andrea wrote a grant for me to go study with Bonnie Cohen, because she was seeing me teach my class and my classes and what I was offering. And she said, you should go study with Bonnie Cohen. And so anyway, I got a grant to go, to take a 2-week course with her. And then I ended up doing a lot of study with her. And I loved the developmental movement. And I kept pestering Bonnie for questions that had to do with creatures, because I was a kind of nature geek. I mean, I just loved being outside and moving in the woods or the forest or the oceans. And so Bonnie gave me this gift and said, I don't know the answer to that question, but why don't you discover it on your own? So, again, then I go to the bookstore, the university bookstores, and buy a couple of books, and I just start diving in with reading various aspects of how, invertebrates, and a book on, creatures before that and creatures after with the spine, and just start, for me, well, let's go try it out in the body. So I then started to develop my own sense of the fluid movement. And so cellular activity. So I was really on to moving with fluids through the metaphor of we're a single cell, and rolling and pouring, because that was nothing new to me, because I spent a lot of time rolling and pouring on different surfaces in nature. And as you yield into that and you let fluid differentiate until you're just particles, you feel this enormous adaptability arise that's always in a total potential possibility to yield and flow. So I think of movement and fluid movement I was moving in that way. And I also had a partnership with another friend and colleague way back where we were teaching a course that was called resonant kinesiology, but it was basically how to attend to people through sound, movement, and touch. And the phrase that was really with this is what's willing to meet me now. So it's a way of communicating and a way of attending to our fluid nature and vibrational nature and our contact, with our bodies to otherness. And so that was this whole other element that when I moved to Maine and then met Kevin, and then I started to hear about Continuum. And then actually I was working with a therapist personally who was really into Continuum. And I think Susan came out to Maine and did a workshop through Gail and another role for Gail Ogren or Rosewood. And Emily would come to Boston. So, that just felt like home to me. That's how the Continuum came in. So there was the experiential anatomy, and then there was, moving in nature. And those threads kind of came together with then joining the club, but never leaving this home in movement and fluid movement and perception and pausing in the pause to feel is how so much shifting can happen, in which the client assumes some of the responsibility, which demands that they show up and attend and feel that they're capable, and help them empowered enough to begin to notice their experience in the uncomfortable and the possibilities for how we might begin to make contact to that in terms of how they could participate, besides be supported through an offering from a practitioner.
And I think what you just said about empowering the client and help in, kind of in a way demanding them to show up.
Yes.
Is so profound, and also can be so frustrating when you're trying to help clients be empowered in the sense that they, as rolfers, we have the skills to kind of help nudge and kind of show the way. But really, with the clients, it is, the way I kind of see my role is to empower. Yes. I love having my, regular clients, but after a while I'm like, okay, it's time for you to kind of feel it, go experience, own it. And then we can kind of come back together. But I know, like, I've had multiple practices, and one was in New York City for quite some time. And it was interesting and it was scary too, as a practitioner, because in a way it feels like a foreign language to some people, and be like, you have to feel your vessel, yourself. And there's some people that are like, I'm paying you, you're going to fix me. And it's just like, well, I can do so much, but really for long lasting changes, it's like, you're the person, the being in this body. Mm-hmm. You have ultimate, authority of how it's going to move and how you're going to present and how you're going to show up. And, I really value what, saying.
I so, again, appreciate how you're, because that's probably the biggest question that I get asked is how do you begin to do these oh so simple things with people, and that whole question. And again, have had lots of time to negotiate and work with that. And I'd say the first layering of that is when I was teaching, just a dance teacher, is that because of that experience with my original teacher, in which I started right off improvising and forming, that I believed that if you can, there's an African proverb, if that's true, that says if you can talk, you can sing. If you can walk, you can dance. And so to get people to feel freely to express themselves creatively in movement and not just repeat, that's something you have to titrate with people. Because I taught, again, thousands of classes all over the world in which people are comfortable and uncomfortable with that. And how do you empower someone as you start off with 3 seconds of a frame that someone can start to take responsibility for moving creatively or within themselves as it translated to perceptual work, so that it comes in these little doses and then they're slowly growing their capacity to sustain a self-awareness that may bump into other things that are uncomfortable, like I really do have to slow down, or I start to run into what I might be holding in my body emotionally, psychologically, and so on and so forth. So that's a delicate dance. And what I love about structural integration and teaching movement is that that it's formed in little bits that someone can then begin to learn how to have the containment of the goals of, let's say, the sessions, or changing how one starts to move and be easier in one body. And then you have more flow. And as I think Kevin likes to say, you start to interrupt the interruptions to flow and inherent easeful movement. And so it's a long journey. It's a very big journey to work with that interval that you're talking about, Nikki. And I've just learned to know, okay, there's people that don't want to go there because they're not ready. There's people that want to go there, but they need it titrated. And for me, that just has to hold and find the right amount of demand that feels appropriate for them to show up. And so it goes. And some go away and then they come back and say, you know what? I wasn't ready, but now I'm ready. So it goes all those different ways, as I'm sure you know, to see what's willing to meet you. And then yeah.
And one thing, I'm going to sort of play it back in the way that I hear it, and please say yes or no or other. Well, the answer, and it really as always with Rolfing, right, is it depends. It depends on every person. But part of how I'm hearing it is when we meet the client, we're meeting them again first from our nervous system to nervous system, and we're getting an idea of this person likely is ready to go a little further. This person likely isn't. And wherever they are, we're just slowly saying, okay, they aren't, because this isn't really how it is, but I've conceptualized it. They're at a 98%. They're at a 98% holding. So I'm going to give them 97% holding, and that 1%, a little less, they're going to feel. And it might take longer for them to be ready, but that's because their lived experience has taught them to not be ready, or taught them to be holding, because the not ready gets a little perspective based. And I try to somewhat get away from that, but again, words.
Yes.
So we're just slowly saying, all right, this person has this armoring, has this holding, and I'm going to show them almost exactly the same, but like one brick less in the wall, something along that lines. And this other person has like almost no bricks, so I can have more fluidity within that. Is that sort of?
Yes, and
like
thank you for that language differentiation about the not ready, because what it's really is that any behavior that people do is serving them. And that's the place that I want to meet people, is with all behavior is founded in preservation. And that's a good thing. And how we begin to, meet that situation is a very precious piece of relationship.
One of my very, very early takeaways from my training with Lael King and Monica Kaspari was often what limits us also serves us.
Yes.
And I say that often to clients who start to like throw some like harsh judgment or negativity on why they hold their body in certain ways or this and that. I'm like, listen, your shoulders, they came up for a reason.
Yes.
And it served you. Otherwise, our bodies wouldn't do it. Our bodies are brilliant that way. But then we have to kind of, dial it back a bit and be like, okay, my shoulders don't need to be up 24/7. They can come down, or whatever postural deviation that they've taken on.
Yes. I did the somatic experiencing training, I think about 20 years ago, something like that. And it was so helpful in illuminating more specifically the nuance of the nervous system and appreciation for, again, behaviors we do served us in situations, and are we ready to update our files in terms of what might serve us better at a particular time in one's life, and again, beginning the journey of that through Rolf movement and structural integration.
I was going to ask you, and I was afraid that it might be too much of diversion, but I was going to ask you with what your knowledge and experience is with somatic inquiries, because we've been kind of talking a lot about movement and structure, but as we also know, a lot of our structure is shaped by our experiences, whether they're amazing, wonderful experiences or traumatic. And in your wealth of knowledge, what could you share about how our movements are shaped, or our somatic being, our somatic experiencing, how that shapes our movement?
Well, I certainly know from my own journey and being with lots of others that in my own journey, there were some significant events that happened early on for me, and then at various intervals that were incredibly overwhelming for me, and that probably contributed in terms of my learning process. That we're not optimum. And as I've learned to befriend those aspects of myself and behaviors that I learned and are still operating, to continue to meet that with kindness in understanding it was serving me. And I just feel that's part of the holism that's possible in working with structure integration and with touch and the series, or with movement, that if we're attuned to that possibility and to the whole safety of how much someone can show up with what they're meeting at intervals or in a session, that there is much more of a holistic presence if we're including an awareness of how the nervous system is regulating or what events might have created interruptions, and just understanding it and know how to be with that in oneself as one is with that with another. So in my work, in terms of how that is, they're at this point, I can't separate the somatic experiencing from the sense of attending to someone. It's in, if I'm teaching a movement class or I'm doing a Rolfing session with someone, that it's always present in the whole picture. And it just feels like it's part of the backing that I had to come to be informed by and work with, and then apply that.
I would love to hear from all the wealth of information you have from, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, this is like you were born and this is, you're destined to be in this. For the audience, and I would love to hear from collectively of all your experience, how would you define somatic experiencing?
Hold on, I'm going to need a moment to feel into this.
I'm going to ask you, Nikki, to clarify a little bit, just to maybe also help Caryn. Are you talking about somatic experiencing strictly as Peter Levine somatic experiencing?
No, that's why, because I want to use, because I feel like you have been in, you said you did the training, but I feel like you've probably been tapped into kind of a little bit of, you're already speaking some of the language that I would like to know your definition, not that someone could Google and get it.
Yes.
Because I think your definition will offer a lot of influences from all the brilliance that you've been exposed to in teaching.
Yes, thank you. Because I thought you meant the SE world, which, you know, I'm a participant of, but I was very aware way back in that resonant kinesiology training. I just, again, didn't have the language or even the science that's been coming out. I think it's a balance of feeling words that are spoken that are coming from, that you have an awareness of the, your body is speaking, that the voice is coming from all, whether you're trembling, whether you're frightened, whether you're whatever you are, the representation of that experience, that your body's included, that the body always has something to say. It's whether we're going to shut up to listen to it or whether we're going to include that on a regular basis to know when we're not present in one's body to sensation, that we can learn to communicate and be with others and be in representational and non-cortical animal body, if you will, or movement body, that the whole flesh of oneself and the whole flesh of the experience are together.
I don't know if the flesh was intentional to relate to Merleau-Ponty's flesh phenomenology.
Yes.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And I'll say there's something sort of adding on to that and I forget if I mentioned this with you and Kevin when I saw you last month. There's this thing I'm working with where more or less the body is non-dual and the mind is dual. And it's the mind that is labeling and creating these narratives of the experience. And when we can get out of that and be in the embodied bodily experience, there is no label. There's just pure experience. There's just pure body. There's just pure life that's allowing us to mix with other aspects of life until the mind comes in and says, oh, pain, or oh, arm, or oh, story. And as we work through the various ways, but the ways that you've mentioned or that you found, we drop into this, or we have ability to drop into this non-dual presence place of just experience, which is the soma, right? The lived body experience, not the corporal, the dead body experience. Right. Is that a way of sort of sharing?
It's beautiful, Andrew. Yes, I feel that it just is so rich and perturbing. I'll use Emily Conrad used to, being perturbated to some of the information we get from here and the choices that we struggle with when we listen to what our nervous system or different aspects of our being is saying. But it's the full catastrophe, as Zorba says, of being alive in a body on this planet. And of course, with the intense challenges that are facing us now, environmentally and socially, it's a very big story. And I think we need all of our resourcing and potential to be collaborating in this question. Somatically. It's a somatic question. The challenge of somatic adventures and misadventures.
Does that answer your question, Nikki?
It does. No, I like to ask that, especially with our movement guests, because I think it's so rich. And I also, again, I feel like the body can be complicated. And I think it's I just enjoy hearing the greater definition, especially from someone like you who has been so entrenched in this world for so long, that getting a different kind of perspective on the definition that's beyond something that can be Googled. And because I think with just from how we started this podcast, we all learn differently. So we're going to hear things differently. And I think, Andrew and I's big motivation behind this podcast is for education and for the greater world of structural integration, not just our Rolf Institute community, Dr. Ida Rolf Institute. So I appreciate just you taking that time, and if it felt risky, thank you.
And Caryn, I'm going to put words in your mouth, and please tell me I'm wrong again. But if you had been asked that question in a classroom or in an environment where you had more time and more space, I have a sense that your answer would be almost less verbal and more question. Okay, I want you to do that, or more experiential, and have people to actually okay, that's
Yes. I'd set up an exercise, a perceptual exploration in which we would hold the question. There would be a little dive, if you will, a time to explore that consideration. And then people would report, and I would pause them if they're in their pause, if they were getting too representational and losing the sense of being informed by sensation as one speaks.
Is this possibly a workshop coming up?
I hope so, Nikki, because it's so talking to you and Andrew and your goal here in offering what can help us in the world from a somatic perspective and from many different perspectives is, let's do it.
Happy to host you here in Boulder.
Okay. Well, believe me, Kevin and I are on the loose now. I don't know if we're kind of homeless right now. So we're getting to that point. We've had a year off where, we, as much as we'd like a home, we realize, we're not doing anything. Let's do some workshops.
Well, we'll share, your website, and people can join, either contact you directly or join mailing list to get contact and to start to share and to sort of say, hey, how can we grow or do this or share this and whatnot. And I know we're going to run out of time soon, but I want to maybe put this as we're not going to have an answer for this. I don't know. But what I'm so curious about and what I'm drawn to is this sense of what I just shared, sort of sharing what I perceived you would do as an answer was nowhere really in my mind. It was a feeling in my body, a response in my body from being here in conversation with you through perceptual awareness, because we're not in the same room, we are in the same time zone, but there is this, and so how or why, is it that there is this sense and then things shift, and again, words get in the way, but there is this resonance before any of the cerebral comes in that just has this rich answer or.
I love that topic, Andrew. And I just realized what struck me as well. Usually, this would be maximum anxiety for me, talking to someone. There's no, I can't hang upside down and all this stuff. But I feel that flesh fullness that I feel so safe with both of you. To be more of who I am, which is, that you are also here, and we're all this body talk is included in the conversation, that we're feeling with our words as our words are feeling with our bodies. And so there's an inner communication of that holistic connection, and then it manifests in instantly in terms of how we feel with each other. I think it's the kind of contagion, even if there's difficulties and challenges to meet differences, that support with, and the practices of these practices that help us be in that flesh fullness and rich communication to find our way.
Yeah, and I think that ties a little into earlier where, think about what are we doing on the table? Are we pushing tissue, this and that? And where is it that growth really happens? And for me right now, it's really like similar. You were saying Kevin saw you making changes without even touching people, and similar. And I shared this with you. I started to practice without even touching people and just being in resonance and creating a place of safety, and the touch is fine too, but that safety is the ground of which growth can happen, or unwinding can happen. At first, we need that safe environment, that safe whatever, as a place from which anything can transform.
Here, I realized that, when I felt my usual anxiety, and the way it manifests in my body, but how what I spoke that I wanted, the emergent form, actually felt. So it was just pleasurable to speak to both of you because of that safety and curiosity to what's willing to arise from our interest and learning from each other. What's up? What's happening?
Yeah. And for me, it's when I'm in conversation, in some regards, I almost never want it to end. I want to swim in the sea for so long. And I also sort of feel that what you said is almost a really nice way of bringing in closure and wrapping up the conversation for today. For today, I don't know if the conversation ever really stops. But for today,
it's curious that you said that. I like that because I feel like the conversation will keep on going, because I will, right after this, I'm doing actually a Zoom Rolf movement session, and I'm so excited.
Nikki, go.
Yeah. So I'm definitely going to be using, if you don't mind, borrowing the pause and the pause. And
go for it. Let me know how it goes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, this client, she's going to get me out. Like I, especially with Zooms, you kind of come up with a little bit of a plan because you don't have the touch and that ability. But I'm so excited to kind of go into a Zoom somatic experience and be like, we're taking everything that I've learned from you and just that conversation and just like the feeling, because while this has been such a weird medium to kind of, especially for body workers and, movement educators and things, I also find it fascinating. And also, again, I'm trying to always kind of figure out the takeaways and like the things that were really terrible, like the pandemic and terrible time to be in the touch business because of fear of being touched and all that. But it's been wild to have that experience of still like I think it's what I'm getting at is soma is so much in languaging, and how that is not lost in Zoom, and how you still can have a very embodied experience. Different. I'm careful to judge it because I feel like I've had some amazing, I did a whole somatic movement certification during the pandemic, and it was so moving. And yeah, when we weren't in a classroom and didn't get to have that, but you got to see all these windows of bodies moving and things. So yeah, I'm just excited. I will be carrying on this conversation after we close here with what we've been talking about.
Yum.
And
Yum,
Nikki, I'm going to say, just for trademarks, let's call it a somatic process instead of a somatic experience, or another word, just because I don't want to get sued later on.
Oh, okay. All right. Because we're like on a computer and it's a processor.
No, because the
somatic experiencing is trademarked.
Got it.
Right.
So
right.
Anyway, but I think I think we should cogitate on this and come up with I've been looking for what is an emergent worm. That's maybe it. Word.
It depends on the rain. If it rains, the worm emerges.
Right. I don't know, but I do have a question of what could be another word for representing this felt sense of experience that the three of us have had and that can happen, that eliminates the spatial, we're communicating, we're in resonance and stuff happens. It's a miracle.
Yeah, a gestalt might be one of the words of it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, we would get stuck in words for days, and then we would be all up in here and not in our bodies. So let's just have some time in our bodies. And I'm really, always grateful to be in conversation with you, Caryn. Whenever I have conversation of any sort, I always message Layla. I'll give a shout out to her and just say, oh, I talked to Kevin or Caryn. And she's always like, oh, excited. What happened? Tell me everything. And so, I'm really happy to share you and ideologies and experiences of you with a greater good. It's really an honor and it's a gift that gives itself back in ways. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's lovely to meet you, Nikki.
Likewise. I will, I'm definitely going to I've been wanting to get into one of your workshops, but it just was kind of a feat to get in that direction. But since y'all are road tripping, maybe you want to come out here.
Okay, we will.
Yeah, and there's a great book that both Kevin and her have wrote. I don't know the past tense word, and I can share a link of that on here for people to find, because you can get on Amazon, or you can do what I did and just message Kevin and drive up one day and say, "Hey, I want to get your book."
Yeah, I got some in the container. Our stuff is in a container, but it's easy access.
So we can link that. Thanks again, Caryn, and have a beautiful day out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Deep pleasure. And I'll see you again sometime.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Caryn at resourcesandmovement.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Thanks, and bye-bye.